Okay, so I just would like to announce that we are probably 5 minutes because the train was delayed with Teis, and he only could get the next one, but they are on the way. And so hi to everybody here online also. So in case you don't hear me, please just send a message. But I guess, and here is Teis already coming, perfectly in time. Okay, so we are just waiting 2 or 3 more minutes to start, and then we'll get going. Thanks. Okay, welcome everybody to the new installment, so to say, of our lecture series, international lecture series, Planning in Transition, New Concepts and Challenges for Sustainable Urban and Regional Change. And our speaker today, which I'm very glad also that he finally made it, even in time, even with all the train problems, but delivered by SCA by the minute. Is Teis Hansen, who is professor at Copenhagen University, Department of Food and Resource Economics. And Teis is also at the same time 20%, I think, senior researcher at the Department of Technology Management at SINTEF in Trondheim. That's a big energy research institute in Norway. And he's also a member of the Danish government's expert group on the role of research in the green transition, and has a strong interest and has worked a lot and published a lot also generally on sustainability transitions, particularly on spatial aspects of such innovation processes. He also works generally on transformative innovation policies and on green urban regional development, and particularly interesting for today, and which you will take up, alternative economics approaches, so particularly a foundational economy, which we will hear more about in a few minutes. And Teis' talk is about rethinking regional development policy, promises and pitfalls. And in general, the idea of our lecture series is to invite people who are engaging with regional development transitions from an innovative perspective, and try to think about how to reshape and how to adapt also urban and regional policies to the new challenges, such as climate change and other challenges coming up. Okay, Teis, I'll move on to you directly. And I hope we don't also, again, for those who are with us online, I hope we don't have any technical problems, but I'll switch off my mic and Theis's mic should work now. So you can.
Yeah, thanks, Harald. That's working.
That's nice. But let's see. And you can hear at least that people see you also online. So here's the camera.
There's the camera. Hello. Oh, there's an echo.
Because we are going to move to the screen sharing. Already. So I hope something will come up. Oh.
Here it comes.
I think it was pressing too quickly. So, but you on the so here we should go to. Just takes, I think it just takes a little. So now it's correct. Okay, yeah, now it's fine here.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Harald. Okay, and thank you for the invitation to come here. So it's actually a bit funny. So I spent almost a decade in Lund, and at Lund, I heard a lot about TMT in particular, and Linköping University. I'd never been to Linköping while I was in Lund. I had to go back over the bridge apparently to get a good reason to come here. Yeah. But very nice to finally be here. So as Harald said, the talk I'm giving here is called Rethinking Regional Development Policy, Promises and Pitfalls. And the starting point, so it's sort of in between, regional development, economic geography, innovation studies. So a lot of the different fields that I've been doing research in, ever since I actually started doing research, so to say. And the starting point is this slide here, which is listing just a small proportion of all the papers over time that have dealt with regional development from the perspective of innovation. Sort of saying that, okay, so if we need to think about how we have to do regional development or what really matters for regional development, we need to consider innovation, right? Innovation is something that is central to allowing for regional development because it creates competitive advantage for firms and industries that allows for regional prosperity. And if we sort of look back, in time, then that sort of says something about economic geography, regional development being very closely tied into the field of innovation studies. Yeah. So if you go to sort of the research but also very much the practice side on regional development, I would argue that there's been sort of this very strong focus on innovativeness of firms and systems, which comes with an emphasis on some specific parts of the economy, those that are research intensive, those that are traded, meaning that they are exporting goods and services, and sort of there are some assumptions behind this suggestion that this is the way forward. There's one which says, okay, these high-tech industries, they create a lot of demand from other industries, business services, etc. But they're also able to pay out high wages to the employees, and they go out and they spend those wages on buying other things. So there's these multiplier effects that are assumed at the regional level. But also, if we sort of look beyond the regions that we focus on, there are certain multiplier effects that are assumed. So often people talk about these trickle-down effects, right? If you have metropolitan regions that are sort of growth poles, right? And they drive development, and that sort of then, with time spreads out to more peripheral or more sparsely populated regions. And then I brought also with me this quote here that you see in the bottom of the slide here, which is just a bit old. It's from European Commission publication from 2008. So that was when I was writing my master's thesis. I came across that one, and I've kept it with me ever since because I think it's kind of one of the best examples I have of a quote that really demonstrates this, this science or this R&D emphasis in policy making. Yeah. So I think if you read the quote, it's actually quite extraordinary what it says there. So given the weight of high-tech sectors in the overall level of business R&D intensity, a change should include the sectorial composition of the business sector, a move towards a higher share of high-tech companies. And policy should change the balance of the industrial structure in favor of these research-intensive sectors. It's actually quite extraordinary that, this is saying, okay, policy should emphasize development of particular industries, those that are R&D intensive, because we want higher R&D intensity in the economy, right? So it's kind of like R&D intensity becomes sort of the goal in itself here, yeah? Without really questioning, okay, but, what is R&D intensity good for? Why is it good to have industries that invest a lot in R&D? Well, probably some aspects are good, but does that actually mean that policy should really try to steer the economy more towards those industries? Well, that's something that I think we can discuss. And we can maybe in particular discuss that because this, what I would call sort of the dominant approach to regional development, has failed to address a number of key challenges that sort of remain with us and have remained with us over time. Yeah. And the first of these is intra-regional inequality, or what you can also call social polarization. Yeah. Where in particular scholars from the LSE, in particular Neil Lee, who's a professor of economic geography at the LSE, has really address this question of the connection between inequality on the one hand and innovation on the other hand. Yeah. And what he shows in his work is that there's actually little evidence that innovative high-tech regions are less deprived and more equal. If there's any evidence out there, it kind of points in the other direction, actually. So innovation in European regions is positively related to inequality, and high-tech industry growth creates poorly paid service jobs in other industries. So to the extent that they actually create jobs in other industries, these are not necessarily jobs that you would be interested in taking up. Yeah? So this is sort of, I guess, one sort of highly problematic aspect that comes from this emphasis on innovation, that it has failed to really convincingly address problems around social polarization at the regional level. Then there's the question of, okay, so what about inter-regional inequality, right? So what about differences between regions that are wealthy and those that are poor? Yeah. So again, if we look at the data, everything tells us that that the gap between the wealthy and the poor regions is only increasing over time. So what you can see on that small graph up there from the Economist is that basically for all the different countries, you have the poorest regions and you have the richer regions, right? In terms of the level of GDP per person. And you have that for 2 points in time. You have it in 2000 and you have it in 2015. So obviously what the first thing you see here is that, well, the poor regions, they are really not moving relative to the national average, right? I mean, there's zero movement. And if there is any movement, it's actually to the negative side, it seems, in most countries. Maybe Spain is the exception, right? Well, there's a little positive movement up for them. But in general, right, they are standing still relative to the averages in the countries where they are based. And then on the other hand, we have some countries where we see that the rich regions, they are really just storming ahead, right? The UK being the obvious example here, but also Germany. Yeah. So in many countries, we see that this gap between poor and rich regions are just becoming even bigger. Yeah. And that is something that has now actually become recognized by, a body that would previously perhaps not have given so much attention to these kind of issues, the IMF, which is not necessarily known for taking questions around interregional inequality into consideration to the highest degree. But they came out with this World Economic Outlook in 2019, where they actually took up this question and saying, okay, it's problematic that the place you are born, the place that you grew up in, actually significantly determines your chances for living a decent life, so to say. So based on this, we can say that, arguably, there's also still a need for rethinking regional development policy from this perspective here, because so far there's actually not really evidence that this innovation-fueled approach to regional development has managed to lift the less developed or the poorest regions out of that position relative to the rest of the countries that they're located in. And then there's a third regional development challenge, which is obviously almost, you would say, that of environmental sustainability, right? Yeah. So we have anecdotal or case-based evidence, you could say, that there are some regions that manage to combine this innovation-led development model with greening of the environment. So the reference here is to a paper by David Gibbs and Catherine O'Neill, where they study Boston, which is one of the case studies they have been working on. Where they show that, okay, in the case of Boston, these two things seem to go hand in hand. Yeah, but there is actually no systematic evidence that innovative regions are also greener, that they are also more environmentally sustainable. Yeah? And this is obviously, I guess we don't need to stress that, but that's obviously really problematic, yeah? Given the urgency of tackling climate change, etc. Right? So if we don't know for sure that this innovation-fueled model of regional development is actually also contributing to environmental sustainability, then that is, of course, something that we should think a little bit about. So I said that for long sort of economic geography, regional development on the one hand, and innovation studies on the other hand, have been sort of fields that are very tightly connected. Yeah. So, however, while we talk about these things still in economic geography, the field of innovation studies has arguably moved on at quite a fast pace, right? So many of you probably know this sort of seminal paper by Scott and Steinmüller from 2018. You can sort of maybe criticize it for being sort of a bit overlooking the finer grains development in terms of the fields of innovation studies and innovation policy. But overall, it works as kind of a nice illustration of the development waves that we've seen within the field of innovation studies. So just very briefly, what they argue is that initially we had a first generation of innovation studies that was really focused on R&D and regulation, looking at single organizations and particularly large firms, understanding how can policy make these large organizations more innovative. Then we have a second generation, national systems of innovation, where we sort of say we recognize innovation is not something that happens only within individual organizations, it's a systemic process. So we need to understand innovation systems. If we are to understand innovation outcomes, we are to also address innovation policy at the system level if we are to actually then influence innovativeness. And then they argue that now we are witnessing this emerging generation here over the last decade or two, perhaps, where the emphasis changes again. Not so much in terms of primarily in terms of how we see innovation and what the goal of innovation policy should be, right? So there's a change towards innovation policy for the sake of innovation to innovation policy for the sake of innovation so that innovation can help us address other public policy priorities, right? So this whole idea of innovation policy needing to do something around grand challenges, help us address them, etc., this becomes very central in this third generation here, right? So this side kind of says the same thing, actually, right? Innovation as a means, not a goal. We move away from innovation in products and processes towards innovation in systems. We talk about socio-technical systems, or we talk about system innovation, right? So we move away from individual products that are being sold by firms and industries and move into thinking about how can we, change the entire energy or transport system in a more sustainable direction. Yeah. And this, of course, comes with a lot of policy challenges, right? So first of all, and perhaps most prominently, right, this idea about directionality. Matthias and Harald wrote this thing, we can call it seminal now, your seminal paper, 10 years ago or so, where they argue that, okay, you actually need to talk about innovations having a direction, right? So planned obsolescence is maybe good for the firms that are selling mobile phones, but is it good for society in general? And if it's not good for society in general, right, should policy incentivize these types of innovations, right? Arguably the same for becoming better at extracting oil and gas out of the ground, arguably the same for some of the financial innovations that were, for example, behind the financial crisis, right? So that is sort of one manifestation of this new wave of innovation studies. And a second one that's sort of very central to policymaking today is, of course, that on the role of missions, right? Mission economy by Maria Mazzucato, and the way it has been taken up in policymaking, in particular at the EU level, but also by many countries, and I think increasingly also by municipalities and regions to start talking about local missions or regional missions, etc. Yeah. So missions here essentially becomes this tool for providing direction into innovation, right? Where, again, we are only interested in funding research or funding innovation activities if they contribute to fulfilling these particular missions. So this was sort of a brief interlude of sort of, what has been going on in innovation studies over the last 10, 15, 20 years. Yeah. And if we then sort of go back to sort of the more regional development side, yeah, we say that it's so far there has been, relatively scarce attention to, taking these issues or absorbing these developments in innovation studies into regional development. Yeah, I mean, there have been some, but not so many. The very early one, which is actually predating a lot of the developments that we saw in innovation studies, is this first paper there by Frank Mullert and Muatsekia. I don't know how many of you heard about it. It's an extremely well-cited paper, extremely well-cited, but I think not so much because of the reasons that the authors wished for. So what they did was that they did a review of what they call different territorial innovation models. So they looked at clusters, they looked at regional innovation systems, industrial districts, innovative milieu, all these different approaches that were sort of happening more or less at the same time in economic geography, and that were more or less all talking about how geographical proximity, knowledge creation, innovation, etc., is central to regional development. So they reviewed that literature, and that is what this paper is being cited for very often, that people use it to talk about, and we have these territorial innovation models, this group of models that are very similar and kind of talk about the same thing. But what they really wrote that paper for was actually a critique of those territorial innovation models, right? So they asked this question here. So how do innovation-focused models of regional development influence life conditions of the regional populations? Yeah. Very important question. Yeah. But maybe they were a bit ahead of time in a way. Yeah. Because these are the kind of questions that we are now starting to ask also in economic geography. And I think it's fair to say that for long, that question was never really answered, at least within the field of regional development or economic geography. So there were some other contributions as well, more like a bit further up in time, and many of these are then starting to take these insights from innovation studies on board, right? Need for greater engagement with the demand side and the geography of innovation literature, right? So it's not only about how we produce new solutions, it's also about how they're being taken up in society and how they thereby change the regions that they are being taken up in. Yeah? Focus on social desirability of new industrial path development, etc. So some movement here, and also to perhaps a smaller extent also some empirical studies that try to do that, because the one that I listed there, they are mostly sort of conceptual, right? But this is one example. Svein Gunnar Sjøtun and Rune Njøs from Bergen, who wrote a paper on what we say sort of the consensual actor in a second generation innovation system, the cluster organization. Yeah. And they asked the question, okay, so how can clusters and cluster organizations play a role in reorientating industries towards sustainability in a quite radical sense? You know, what are the options? What are the barriers to that? Yeah. So has been starting to be taken up, but at the same time, I would say that there's also now perhaps more momentum outside of sort of the economic geography proper, you can say, right? So this is why Harald said that we'll talk about alternative economic theories or concepts today, right? Because sort of outside of the proper economic geography, regional development, we see that there's a whole forest of different approaches that are sort of starting to come up, right? So donut economics, well-being economy, degrowth, yeah. The everyday economy, written by a member of parliament in the UK from the Labour Party called Rachel Reeves, and then also the foundational economy, right? So essentially, these are all sort of alternative approaches, which in my sort of interpretation have come to the front, partly due to some kind of, how do you say, desperation about the way that practice and mainstream research has been carried out, right? So a lot of this is coming from people who are sort of at the border between research and policy making, yeah, more than sort of proper university research, as we would say. Foundational economy is perhaps the exception here, because this is actually promoted by a group of scholars, but I'll say a little bit more about that. Yeah. So there's these are just examples, and I don't know all of them very well, to be honest. I mean, foundational economy I worked a lot on. Madeline Wahlund and myself, we wrote a paper where we were comparing it to donut economics as an example, to sort of see, okay, where do we have overlaps? Where do we have complementarities? Where do we have differences between these approaches? Yeah? But I think this could be done between all of them, you could say, and even also others that are not mentioned here, because there are many different out there. Yeah. So today I'll focus mostly on the foundational economy. I'll focus on that, but I'm happy to discuss the other ones also, to the extent that I have knowledge about them, and maybe some of you know more about them than I do in this room here or online. But we can get back to that maybe towards the end. Okay, so what is the foundational economy? I talked about foundational economy, mentioned it. What is it? Well, it is an approach to regional development or economic development in general, yeah, that argues that we should emphasize what they call the mundane services, right? So those services that all of us need to get through everyday life, at least at some point in our lives, yeah? So they talk about two different parts of this. They talk about the material foundational economy, and they talk about the providential foundational economy. So the first one is focused on delivering like water, energy, food, etc. And the second one is more concerned with welfare services, right? So education, elderly care, health, these types of aspects. Yeah. So they argue that this should be central when we think about economic development. Yeah? And this is then, as you probably can see, a quite radical change from where we were in the beginning, right? R&D, high tech, exporting industries should be focus for regional development. And now here we are talking about everything that is more or less not exported, right? Or all those things where at least, you know, we need them to be there in order to get through our everyday lives. Yeah. So I became really interested in this, partly because of where I came from, and partly because of the sort of the argumentation they used for why this is important at first. Yeah. So this is a graph from my own PhD dissertation, so it's quite old. And I did my PhD, part of it on innovation in low-tech industries. Yeah? So those that are not investing a lot in R&D. Yeah? So wood products, for example, right? Yeah. And I became interested in that because I started to look at the data, and what was interesting was that So this gives you share of manufacturing employment across 10 different European countries, yeah, and how it developed over time. And all the high-tech industries that everybody were talking about, like IT and biotech and all these things, right? And that policies were always promoting. I mean, that's the line in the bottom here, right? At 8%, rock steady over time, right? No increase whatsoever. And the low-tech industries that no one were interested in, they were the ones in the top, right? Around 40%, and then it decreases a little bit. But then we see an increase in what's called medium low-tech, which is still not, it's pretty far away from being high-tech, right? So actually, over time, these non-R&D intensive industries, they are also quite stable, or they were at least back then. And the foundational lists, as they're called, the ones that wrote this book, the foundational economy, and a lot of the papers that have been accompanying it, right? They use kind of a similar argument here. So they distinguish between, again, the material foundation, right? So water, energy, food, etc. Providential FE, welfare services, etc. And then they distinguish the rest into two other things. They talk about overlooked activities, which essentially are goods and services that are, culturally defined as being essential, but you can live without going to the hairdresser, or you can live without going on vacation. But anyway, it's something that's seen as being, kind of foundational, something that you should have access to, culturally defined. And then in the end, you have all the other things, which to a large extent are those industries that are exporting goods and services. And what they say is, okay, look at the UK, look at Italy, look at Germany, right? The foundational economy sectors, they make up a very large extent of economic activity. Shouldn't we give them a bit more attention? And of course, they say, yes, we should. Yeah. Okay. They also have an argument for why it is particularly important that we give more attention to foundational sectors now, today. Yeah. So what they say is that what has happened over the last decades is that we've seen an increasing financialization of foundational services. Okay. So financialization for me is like one of these terms, you never really know what it is. You kind of have an idea of what it is, but people talk about it in different ways, right? But so when I talk about it here today, I talk about it as sort of meaning mostly two things. So one is that profit increasingly comes from financial practices rather than simply selling goods and services on sort of over the counter, so to say. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that it implies a prominence of one particular group of stakeholder, namely those that are owning shares in firms, right? And so their interests becomes much more dominating relative to other stakeholder groups, right? Employees, suppliers, customers, for example. Right? And because of that, because of this prominence of the stake of the shareholder, right? What we see when we see a financialization of a sector is also that there's increasing pressure on delivering higher returns on investments. Yeah? So short-termism, being able to pay out dividends to your shareholders, becomes more important. Yeah? And this is something that fits very poorly with the dynamics of foundational services. Right? So these sectors, foundational sectors, they deliver stable but low returns of investments over time, right? Contrary to more exporting traded industries, which often deliver higher returns, but also are more unstable over time, yeah? So that means that if we want to, take more money out of these industries than what they are actually sort of naturally, you can say, designed to deliver, we need to do something. What can we do? Well, we can reduce the salary that we pay to our employees. We can offer them poor working conditions, so we are saving money on that. We can squeeze our suppliers, or we can simply take up debt in our firm, right? So, I mean, that's a quite common practice in many firms, that they are taking up debt in order to be able to pay out dividends to the shareholders, right? And this has, of course, some important implications, right? Of course, if you are directly employed there, it's not so fun anymore if you have to work longer hours and you're being paid less, right? But it also matters for all of us, right? Because the foundational sectors, they are delivering these services that we need every day, right? And if the trains are not running well, or if the electricity is not there whenever we need it, right? This has implications for our lives, yeah, and our life quality. So the argument is that because we've seen this financialization of foundational services, there is an even stronger argument for doing something, right? We need to do something. We need to put focus on this part of the economy in a way that's different from what has been done before. Yeah. And what these foundationalists, they suggest is to introduce so-called social licenses, right? Which are social obligations that these providers of foundational services, they have to fulfill in return for the right to operate in markets that are partly shielded from competition, right? Because that's another sort of characteristic of these sectors, is that, you know, there's not full perfect competition, right? Because they are, for example, you know, based on rail networks, right? And that sort of limits the kind of competition you can have. Yes, you can have, you know, then you have a tender for operating this rail line for the next 5 or 10 years, right? But then once that has happened, well, then there's no competition. So it's a different type of competition. Yeah? So these social obligations should be used to secure social returns from the functioning of these sectors, right? In the form of training, minimum wages, use of local suppliers, and also requirements regarding financial practices, right? So we don't exactly do this thing about taking up a lot of debt and then sort of accumulating this in these organizations that are hugely important for all of us. So it's important to say that this is not necessarily, in the foundationalist view, a question of transferring ownership from private to public. One could think that maybe this is what they're thinking, but it's not, right? And there's an important argument for that, and that is that they actually also see that a lot of the public suppliers of these foundational services also engage in these dubious activities. So there's an example in the book that's very telling about welfare workers in Italy and how they are being increasingly squeezed by their public employers, right? So the argument is, okay, it's not necessarily solving the question just to transfer ownership of this part of the economy back, if it has been privatized, back into the public sphere. That's not what it is about. And then we move back to the regional scale, right? Because so far we haven't really talked about that in relation to foundational economy. Yeah? And it is also sort of a general approach to economic development, but it has very specific implications at the regional level. Yeah. So one is that the regional scale is central for organizing the delivery of these foundational services, right? So all the providential ones, they more or less require face-to-face interaction, right? And all the material ones, they are very tied to physical infrastructures. Yeah. There's also a point of regional cultures and identities might influence conceptions of what actually constitute foundational services. And there's an argument there that to say, okay, then that if there are cultural differences between what is considered foundational, then maybe it's advantageous to discuss these aspects at the regional scale. And then finally, the third point is that local and regional experiments may also play a central role in the initial development and implementation of foundational economy principles into policymaking, right? So there's several different arguments for why foundational economy approach, it comes with sort of particular implications when we talk about regional development. And it has indeed also been taken up in practice, right? So this is not just something on paper at university desks, yeah? So in particular, Wales has been early out in embracing foundational economy as a part of the regional development strategy. Yeah? So they are using foundational economy principles and thinking in designing policy initiatives and policy instruments, yeah? But that also, I think, in a way, kind of raises maybe some kind of a warning sign here, because before we do this, right, maybe it's smart to consider, okay, do we think that there's a good argument that foundational economy principles can actually help us address some of these problems that I started out by talking about, right? So that's what I will turn to now, right? Considering, okay, what are the opportunities and limitations of a foundational economy approach to regional development in addressing these identified challenges, right? Social polarization, interregional inequality, and environmental sustainability impacts. Are there good, in other words, asking, are there good arguments for why taking a foundational economy perspective would help us address these problems that I would say the previous approach to regional development hasn't helped us to overcome? Yeah. So I'll go through them one after the other. Yeah. So the first one is social polarization. And here I think that there's a threefold argument for why foundational economy would very likely actually improve the ability of policy to actually address that. Firstly, because it changes the focus to industries that actually constitute the majority of employment. Secondly, it ensures that these employees, they have decent working conditions, right? And thirdly, because it will hopefully improve the quality of these services that matter for all of us, right? And there's a value to that for everybody, even those people, of course, that are not on the labor market, right? So from this perspective, say, okay, yes, indeed, there are very good arguments for why that would help address social polarization. One thing, and that is more a thing in a bracket, I would say, but something that I mean, coming from innovation studies, is something that I care about and that I think is worth considering, is in this case, in this instance here, considering what role do they foresee for innovation in addressing social polarization, and that is actually very unclear if you read the text. Yeah, so they seem to suggest that innovation is something that happens in high-tech industries, yeah, and it's considered to be exogenous to the foundational economy. So they talk about foundational sectors as being technology users, yeah. But as Lars Kuhnen and Kevin Morgan pointed out not so many years ago, they say, okay, there's not necessarily any conflict between a foundational economy approach to economic development and a broad view of what innovation is actually about, right? So my suggestion is to say, okay, rather than thinking that innovation is something that is happening outside of the foundational economy, maybe it would be beneficial to start engaging with literatures on public sector innovation, on low-tech innovation that are a bit less mainstream than sort of the general innovation literature, but which could hold a lot of promise in terms of understanding better, okay, how, I mean, if we can actually make the foundational economy more innovative, well, that should only help us address these issues around social polarization as well, right? If we are able to improve the way we deliver these services, well, that's only going to be good for all of us that consume them, etc. So rather than sort of disregarding innovation in this sense, maybe it would be good to more embrace the sort of more alternative theories around innovation that are out there also. Then there's the second one, which is interregional inequality. Yeah? And here there's also a lot of promise in a way, because foundational services, they are geographically distributed, right? And that is because they require this face-to-face interaction, or it's closely tied to these material infrastructures, right? And that means it's available everywhere, right? So foundational economy sectors, they are quite important for the economy in also peripheral areas, right? So the argument that is also very explicit in the book by the foundational economist is that, well, foundational economy constitutes an improved starting point for thinking about embedded regional development policies in less developed regions, right? Because it actually takes a starting point then in the economic activities that really are already there, right? So it's not this castles in the sky. We want to attract another Silicon Valley to our small peripheral region, etc., that we have seen for long and in numerous examples, and that never works, right? No, here we actually take the starting point in the part of the economy that is already there. However, there is probably one important caveat to this, yeah, and that is around the question of these peripheral regions to actually successfully govern the foundational economy, yeah, because as the foundational economists, they say themselves, this is not an easy thing, right? It's not an easy thing to develop these social licenses, to implement them, to monitor them, etc., etc. These activities are resource and they are skill intensive. Yeah. The suggestion in the foundational economy book of how to handle this is to say, okay, we need actually greater devolution of resources and power to the local and the regional level. We need to give the local and regional governments the ability to actually do this. Right? But there's not necessarily an argument, if you go to the literature on decentralization, that says that this is actually necessarily a good idea, right? Because we know from previous work that if you decentralize power and resources to regions that are poorly functioning, then that's actually worse for those regions than if you keep the resources and the power more centralized, right? Which kind of makes sense, right? I mean, if you have an ill-functioning regional government and you give that ill-functioning government responsibility for a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of policy areas, well, there's a big risk that they're going to do it worse than if the more central government had actually taken care of that. Yeah? So in that sense, it's not a given, I would say, that decentralization will in any way promote FE development in lagging regions, right? At least it is something that needs to be accompanied by very specific efforts in increasing the institutional capacity, the government capacity in those regions, because simply decentralizing and say, okay, here you go, now you can sort of manage the foundational economy on your own, is something that is not in any way necessarily going to work. So that provides some question marks around sort of the ability to actually per se address these questions around interregional inequality. I wanted also to quickly share with you findings from a paper that came out a few years ago. Birgitte Nygaard, who's now doing a PhD at NTNU in Trondheim, and myself, where we looked at priorities at the local level. So at the municipality level, all 98 municipalities in Denmark, we simply went through their strategic development plans, and we looked at their priorities, right? Okay, so what are they actually prioritizing in their strategy plans? Are they giving priority to foundational economy part of the economy, or are they giving priority to exporting traded industries? Yeah? So in Denmark, the municipalities, they have a lot of responsibility for delivering all these welfare services that we talked about, not in terms of hospitals, but education and elderly care and childcare and all these things. So we kind of had the expectation that we would see quite a lot of focus on foundational economy sectors in the strategies, and that was also the case. I mean, there was a clear overview of overweight of priorities around foundational economy sectors in the strategies. But what was interesting was that if we then look at differences across different types of municipalities, right, the more metropolitan the municipalities, the greater focus they had on foundational economy part. And the more rural, the more peripheral, the opposite. Yeah? So that's kind of the opposite of what we would maybe expect, right? This idea that it offers in particular a chance for the rural or the peripheral municipalities. Yeah? And then we did a follow-up deep dive on two municipalities, two rural municipalities, one that really had an emphasis on foundational economy and one that really had an emphasis on the exporting economy, yeah, in their strategy plans, to understand, how the plans actually came about, yeah, why these priority areas, etc. And what was really clear there was that, foundational economy was seen as something that you could prioritize if your economy was otherwise developing well, right? So if you were wealthy, if the wealthy municipality said, okay, we can afford this, yeah, this is going well, but then of course we are looking into a crisis now, so then we have to scale down our investments and our priorities around foundational economy. And the poor one was sort of more, well, we have to get exporting industries in, otherwise we will never be able to afford investments in foundational sectors, right? So that shows something about that foundational economy is seen as something that's, it's not the starting point for regional development. No, it's something that comes further down the line, right? If you are doing well in regional development in general, well, then you can afford to invest in foundational economy. And then we have the third one, yeah, which is around environmental sustainability, yeah, which has so far received quite limited attention in work on foundational economy. So it's been called sort of the elephant in the room, and they've argued that there's a need for deeper thinking about this, yeah. I would argue that it's not simply a matter of neglect, but rather a lack of recognition of possible trade-offs between social and environmental aspects in foundational economy thinking. Yeah. So, this yellow vest here is one illustration of this. So it's of course, from the French yellow vest movement, right? And the back of it says, we want less taxes, we want more purchasing power, we want to live, not survive. Yeah. And this says something about this trade-off in a way, right? Which hasn't really been acknowledged seriously in work on the foundational economy. Yeah. So this leads us to thinking about, how do you actually determine foundational priorities? And in work by foundational economies, they talk about that the blindingly obvious starting point for spatially confined foundational policies is to ask citizens what they want, right? So turns out, unfortunately, that if you ask citizens what they want to own a car. They don't want to subsidize public transport. Yeah? And if you go to environmental psychology, this is actually not really surprising, right? Because there you find that there are many, many different individual barriers to citizens' environmental behavior that goes all the way from, distance and time and space to environmental problems, but also simply some people, they have a preference against pro-environmental behavior, right? So if you simply ask people what they want, they're not necessarily going to give you the answer that you want to hear. This is also linked to this question of how to establish the content of these social licenses that I mentioned before, right? So these social licenses, that's really sort of the central intervention in the foundational economy thinking, right? But there are very few details on how to actually go about this. And there are very few details on how to maybe, integrate environmental standards into that. Or I say a few details, there's actually no details around that, yeah? And if we go to the literature on sustainability transitions, right, which is in a way comparable because it also deals with these fundamental systems that we need in our everyday life, right, and how to make radical change towards sustainability there, transport, food, etc. Well, then one key aspect that comes there, one key insight is that, well, we need many different policy interventions, both on the demand side and on the supply side, right? So in that perspective, this idea of, a social license that should rule them all, so to say, right? Looks maybe a little bit naive, right? You could almost compare it to some economists thinking about the CO2 tax as, the policy instrument that will take care of all the problems, right? We just need a CO2 tax and then we'll all be fine, yeah? So here there's probably a lot of potential in drawing on insights from the literature that's associated with sustainability transitions around policy mixes, which sort of argues that, you know, we need to look at entire portfolios of policy instruments and strategies and the relations between all these different elements if we are to achieve radical sustainability changes in these socio-technical systems. Okay, so the conclusion on this part is that, okay, perhaps it's not blindingly obvious that foundational principles, they should be established by asking citizens what they want. And the suggestion could maybe be to start taking environmental sustainability more serious by engaging more with questions or topics that are coming out of ecological economics, yeah, where, you know, issues around priority setting, hierarchies of needs, these kinds of, you know, more difficult, more complex, but also essential questions are being taken up and are also actually sort of, to some extent at least, tried to be communicated into more specific frameworks that can be used by policymakers when they are facing, you know, these situations where you have trade-offs between, for example, social and environmental priorities. Good. I'll skip this slide because this is simply summarizing, I think, a lot of what I've said so far. So this is from the paper that sort of goes through these different dimensions. Yeah. And then I want to end here by looking a bit more forward. Right? So obviously, I talk about many different literatures that foundational economy could profit from engaging more with. Yeah. But here I want to move a bit further and sort of put three more specific themes for future work that I see as being important if we want to sort of, you know, build on foundational economy principles and build on them in a way to make regional development policy better. Yeah? And the first of them is that I think we need to have more empirical analysis. Right? So this literature on foundational economy, there are many ideas about how the foundational economy should be governed, but there's much less empirical analysis about, you know, how it should be done, what is actually the role of the foundational economy sectors, and so on. Yeah. So I had a good colleague in the UK who talks about the importance of taking the foundational economy from advocacy to analysis. Yeah. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, advocacy should be abandoned, but if you advocate based on a very shallow level of analysis, of course, it also becomes a much less powerful piece of advocacy. So one thing that we did recently was that we were trying to get at this, the first sub-bullet there, right? In which ways do the foundational economy actually matter? So we looked at the role of the foundational economy across time and space in Sweden in terms of explaining employment dynamics in local labor markets, right? Okay, so if we look at the, simply explained, if we look at the composition of the local labor market in terms of how much employment do we have in different parts of the foundational economy, how much do we have in exporting sectors, yeah? What seems to be the relation with in terms of how employment at that local labor market develops over time. Yeah? So we do that longitudinal over 2007 to 2016. So we take the financial crisis and then the recovery period also after that. And then, of course, we do it across all the different local labor markets in Sweden, right? So from the most peripheral to Stockholm, to Gothenburg, and to Malmö. Yeah? And what we find, so it's a very empirically rich paper, so I won't go into details, but there's a lot of variation, a lot of it depends on space and time, etc. But we do find two things that I think are interesting. One is that, yes, foundational economy seems to be very important, in particular in the most peripheral local labor markets. Yeah, but which is perhaps even more interesting, what really is crucial to explain, developments in employment over time is not foundational economy on its own. It's not exporting economies on its own. It's actually the link between the two. Right? So we use this. It's coming out of economic geography. It's called related variety, where you look at the relatedness. How connected are industries in a particular area, right? in terms of, employees going from one industry to the other. Yeah. And when we look at this, right, that comes out really strong between foundational and exporting sectors, right? Much stronger than within foundational and within exporting. So what that kind of points to, I think, is something interesting. That is that we should not just focus on the exporting industries. We should not just focus on the foundational sectors. We should actually look at the integration between the two. So I think it's quite important in moving sort of beyond this foundational traded dichotomy, as I said here, right? Okay, for long, we've only been talking about the exporting sectors. Now we have this suggestion here that, we should focus all our attention on the foundational sectors. Well, actually, probably the answer is neither of the two, but maybe we need to look at how foundational and exporting industries, they are interconnected and how they can support each other. At least that's what it looks like when we look at the Swedish data here. Second theme, digitization, right? So if you go to a classroom in the north of Sweden today, it might look like this. Also in Norway and in Finland, many places, right? The teacher is on the screen. At the same time, we also have this type of employment, right? Okay, so this is Danish. Sorry about that. It's a travel agency. It says, how do you become a digital nomad, right? So this idea that, people can work from wherever they are. Yeah? So what are the implications for the ability of the foundational economy approach to address interregional inequality of digitization? I think this is a really interesting empirical question to ask, and I can't answer it myself a priori, because on the one hand, remote working creates these opportunities for people to work everywhere, right? Also for people employed in foundational economy, and there are most of them in the metropolitan areas. So they can potentially take their jobs, maybe, and move away to periphery and sit there. On the other hand, we also have these previously immobile jobs in the provision of foundation economy sector services that become mobile, right? That is exactly what that high school picture from the north of Sweden is saying, right? So before, the teacher would have to be located in that small classroom, right? No longer. Now he can be in Umeå or in Stockholm for that sake, right? So the driver of foundational economy for local employment in the periphery is also threatened by digitization, right? So this, I think, is something that would be really interesting to also unpack. And then there's a third one, which is maybe it's a lot less sort of, policy relevant applied research, but sort of more curiosity driven. But that's something I've been puzzling with, uncovering the foundation. So Smiley here says this doesn't mean foundational economy, right? But the foundations of regional policy assumptions, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, by that I mean that, we have this, as a researcher, I think you come across that when you deal with policymakers or you engage with policymakers over time. We have this very dominant, very sort of sedimented understanding of what actually works in regional policy, right? And that's what I put in quotation mark here. It's not a quotation by someone, but that is sort of the essence of what I see as being this shared understanding, right? Which is that competitive economy provides the wealth that allows us to finance, all the FE activities. Yeah? And therefore, competitive economy should be central in policymaking. Yeah? So these are questions that sort of come up for me that I think would be interesting to look into, right? What is actually the logic? What is the implicit, explicit theory of change behind this shared understanding? How prevalent is this shared understanding, and what is it based on, right? Which are the best cases, which are the models, etc., that we can trace it back to, if possible, yeah? And what are the implications of this shared understanding for policy practices and implementation? Yeah? So, something to look into by someone in the future. Yeah? Okay, I'll wrap up. Last slide, conclusion. So, my take on this is foundational economy is a promising approach to deal with challenges that relate to social polarization, some question marks around interregional inequality, and serious question marks around environmental sustainability, right? And in order to address these question marks, I think there's a need for engaging much broader with the knowledge base that we find in a number of different literatures out there. Yeah. So for me, foundational economy is not a panacea, no, but it may still sort of be something that is shaking up our idea about what regional development policy is about. Yeah. And maybe it can actually help us towards a more holistic approach to regional development than what we continue to see, the more narrow one focusing on exporting industries. Okay. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you. Yeah. And happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Thanks much, Teis.
Should I stop sharing here?
Yes, thought-provoking presentation.
I don't know.
Yes.
This is a Mac. I know nothing about Macs. Yeah.
So it's just a bit slow again, because I just wanted to say then also people on, okay, and I think we can switch. I don't know, Mosen, do you know how to get rid of? Because it doesn't matter. Because I just wanted to say, people who are online, you can also ask questions in the chat if you like. Okay, so here it would come up. Question and answer Q&A. Sorry. Sorry for everybody participating online and not seeing the slides. Next time we will do better.
Oh, Jesus.
Anyway, too late for that. And we'll put up the slides on the homepage.
Sorry.
Yes. So you'll be able to check them out afterwards. Anyway, are there questions now? Confusing to see yourself in the yes, also.
Yes, I was wondering about the foundational economy and the relation to the informal economy and like sharing and that kind of things.
So I guess that there's partly an overlap, right? In the sense that there are some parts of the foundational economy where the informal economy probably constitutes an important part, at least in some context, right? So I guess food production is one example of that. On the other hand, I think there are many parts of it where, I mean, energy, water, heating, these types of services probably only to a very limited extent are they provided through the informal economy, right? Probably to a very large extent, these are delivered by these large utilities, and it is indeed very much part of the formal economy. Yeah. Did you have any other reflections than sort of on that possible connection? Yeah.
Energy cooperatives produce electricity, and I was thinking, are they discussed these kind of economic activities that might not, perhaps energy production would be visible, but some informal activities that they will not be visible in economic.
No, that's true. Yeah.
I was thinking, are they discussed as a part of?
Yeah. No, not really. No, they're not. And that is also, I think, because there's this focus on these social licenses, right? And how do you implement them in the informal economy? That's perhaps not very straightforward to answer that. Yeah. yeah, true energy cooperatives. Also depends a bit where you draw the line between what is informal and what is formal. Yeah. But no, it's not a big theme. No, it's not a big theme here. But it could be, right? It could be. I think in particular in relation to food, right? And food like co-ops and these kind of things. Yeah.
Describe this to us, but do you think this interest in foundational economy is driven by a crisis in the sector or a kind of more smart understanding how things works? That it always has been in that way, but we haven't seen it? Or is it you were into financialization and this type of race to the bottom things? So what is your idea of this? Is this because the crisis, or because this is the way it always has been, but we haven't been able to see this?
Yeah. So I think to some extent it's at least something that is has been building up over time, and now we see that we are in the midst of these multiple crises at the same time, and I think that there are many who kind of have a need to do something at least, right? Yeah. And I said that the foundational economy was the one that's sort of the most driven by academics, and that's true compared to the other approaches, which are maybe sort of more activist or more in the border between policy and academia, right? I mean, Kate Raworth is someone that has really been a boundary spanner, I think, between those different spheres. But at the same time, the academics that are behind this foundational economy collective, as they call it, right? They are very, very politically engaged. Yeah. And they want to change things. Yeah. So, and I think, they have probably always been there. Yeah. But maybe they are becoming more vocal, and maybe they're also becoming better at actually communicating their ideas and alternatives. And maybe also on the side of government, maybe there's also today more of a recognition that, we need to do something. We need to do something different than what we've done before. And I think also then sort of not only in regional development policy, but also when we talk about research and innovation policy, we have also seen that, there are changes in terms of what can be achieved when you interact with policymakers, right? Of course, in Sweden, Vinnova has always been quite progressive, but I think that in Denmark, policymakers, they have not always been so progressive in research and innovation policy, and they are clearly moving in that direction, right? OECD is also moving more in that direction. So I think we can say that it's maybe also a case on, how receptive the other side is to these arguments, which are not all new, right? But maybe also communicated in a better way, a more effective way today. Yeah.
Thank you, Teis. I think it's also, this brings to my question really, which I'm thinking about, could also the, Agenda 2030, the Green Deal, and the newer versions of smart specialization strategy documentation pushed from the European Commission and onwards, it kind of clicks into this thinking.
Sure.
So another kind of big agenda, in a sense, that sort of could link into this with a more holistic perspective, and also, so is that also playing into this? Do you think that the outside academia foundational economy is coming perhaps as part of that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think at least it has the potential, right? Then there's this question: is it going to be? I mean, is foundational economy going to be the version of this that's going to be taken up in Brussels or wherever it is, right? I mean, that's hard to say, yeah. But I do think that there are also in these spheres, I mean, there is, from what I can see at least, there is a greater sort of recognition of the importance of these types of perspectives, right? And that doesn't mean that things change quickly, right? So I think if you look at the EU, right, one of the most interesting cases now, maybe the food sector, yeah, where on the one hand, you have the farm to fork strategy, which is actually quite bold in some aspects, you know, quiet, forward-looking, quiet, transformative compared to what we've seen before, right? So that's being implemented, but at the same time, you still have the CAP, right? Still have the Common Agricultural Policy, yeah? And which is being revised every 4 or 5 years, right? And it becomes sort of maybe slightly green, etc. But the foundation of it, that farmers, they are being paid for producing, right? And right, financial transfers, right, is not seriously challenged, right? So we see this policy layering, I would say, right, where you have an uptake of some of these new ideas. They do become implemented. They do become they transform into actual policy instruments that have real effects out in the world. But at the same time, doesn't mean that we are getting rid of the old, so to say, right? Yeah, and that is, of course, a fundamental problem here. That, you know, the stack of policies is becoming bigger and bigger, and they are not necessarily synchronized, right? And that's also why I think, from this perspective, it's also important to consider this policy mix aspect. Yeah.
Okay, we have a raised hand here, Margareta. I hope. Can you say something? I hope you can. Because I don't know how you. On
participants, I think you can then allow.
Yeah.
Allowed to talk.
Margareta, can you say something?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, now we hear you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for the very nice presentation. My name is Margareta Turbani. I am from UAV University in Venice. I would just like to ask the speaker, the professor, if he has, well, let's say on one side, evidence, and also what is his own opinion regarding the mix of state and market in providing this foundational economy, because we know that this sector are organized on a different base in different countries, and therefore the regions are, let's say, in a different position in terms of facing market constraint or you know, an active public sector. So of course, I suppose that we need a mix of both market and state policies. But I just would like to know your position regarding this, because some of these services and let's say basic needs could be provided by in a different way by different institutional settings.
Sure. Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, so I don't have a very clear opinion on what to nationalize or what to keep in the private sphere. But what I do think is important to consider is that, you know, this idea of the state only being there to optimize the way that the market functions, right? I think that's sort of the central aspect that we need to get away from, right? So the state can also be knowledgeable. The state can also have the right to set an opinion for the direction that we want our society to be in. And it can also at sometimes be innovative even, right? Yeah. So, you know, and then who gets the responsibility for actually delivering in the end, I think is maybe more of an open question. So that was, I think, the one way I could answer your question. The other one is that I think that when we look to some of these core infrastructure sectors like energy, for example, right, or some parts of the transport sector. Personally, I've never really understand the reasons to privatize them or being so crazy about privatizing them. I think there must be a value of keeping control of these, key infrastructure sectors, and not sending them out on the market. Of course, there can be then different ways of keeping that control, and full state ownership is not necessarily one of them. But I personally, I'm not in favor of selling off all these infrastructure sectors just to get some cash and just to get some higher efficiency, because it of course comes at the cost of control. But I guess that's almost kind of an ideological question there. What you think is good and what you think is bad, yeah, and how you will prioritize these things, yeah. But personally, I'm not sure that I see the value of privatization when we talk about things such as the core energy system, for example. Yeah.
In one thing I still wonder also is kind of a basic question: to which extent or how you delineate this foundational?
Sure.
So I didn't get around that.
No.
Is it an economic sector, so a field of economic activities which maybe means it's a bit more to low tech, but which you could also think about high tech solutions? Or is it rather a set of problems, which would be then work relations, welfare issues, which are maybe not, only provided by one sector, but which still stretch in a sense across, and you can talk about work relations also in the export sector. Or is it a different concept of the economy, how to think about it?
Sure. So again, that's a question you can answer it in different ways. Yeah. So one is that you look at what is being provided, right? You look at what you need in your everyday life to get through, you and your children and your grandparents, etc., right? And what they need to actually live through their everyday life. And those sectors that you cannot get around, they constitute the foundational economy. Yeah. But then they say, okay, this can also be, there can be cultural variation here, right? And also variation over time. Yeah? So therefore, they argue that there's not one single set of foundational activities. Yeah? That being said, obviously, if you want to, calculate these bars of, okay, 35% are in foundational economy, etc., well, then you kind of need to have some strict definitions, right? And then there is one that is based on NACE codes, yeah, where they've simply divided the entire economy into these 4 different classes. Yeah, and that's also the one we used in the paper on the foundational economy in Sweden. Luckily, our reviewers never asked that question because, of course, it's one that you can highly criticize, right? I mean, the world is not easily placed into NACE codes, but we do it anyway. Yeah, but sort of conceptually getting back to that, right? The idea is really, it is about these services that we need, right? And so that's also why I think there are some quite interesting links to sustainability transitions, right? Because these are also the kind of sectors that we tend to focus on when we research there, right? From the same argument, exactly, right? We need to transition these core systems, right? There's not so much on transitions in hairdressing or in tourism and these kind of things, even though, I mean, not saying it's completely unimportant, but there's this tendency to focus on those sectors that truly matter, right? And that's the same here. Yeah? Good.
Otherwise,
no?
we are almost half past anyway. And there will be time also to, at least for those in place, just to talk to Teis, and we'll be around for a while. Thanks much, everybody, for participating, and thanks a lot.
Sorry to the online people. Yeah.
better next time.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.